Just a couple of weeks ago, new President Joe Biden announced that they would be ending support, US support for offensive operations in the UAE-Saudi war on Yemen. This is something that a lot of activists have been doing a lot of work to try to move the US towards for years now. So seems like good news, but is it all it's cracked up to be? How is this actually gonna work? Well, we're very lucky to be joined once again on the program by the legislative manager for Middle East policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Hassan El-Tayyab, welcome back to the Damage Report.
Hey, thank you so much.
Glad to have you back on. We've talked about this topic several times over the past couple of years. This looks pretty good. When you saw this announcement, how did you respond to it?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for covering Yemen. It's not something a lot of media outlets are doing these days, and I just really appreciate it. So I was overjoyed that something that we've been lobbying on for 3-4 years or so finally came to fruition. I'm gonna get into some of the questions we have, but I wanted to take a moment to breathe and celebrate the activism that went into making this happen. I don't give full credit to the Biden administration or even House Democrats or Senate Democrats. This was really the grassroots and Yemeni activists around the country, humanitarians, grassroots activists all over, and great journalists really put the pressure to make this happen. Now, what happened is the Biden administration said they're going to end US military support for offensive operations in the Saudi UAE-led war in Yemen and offensive weapons as well. So the big question is, what does that really mean in practice? We originally got into the war on a defensive mission to support Saudi Arabia, and that defensive support went into supporting airstrikes on Yemen. So we have to be really careful. Luckily, there are members in Congress right now that are trying to get those questions answered, and that's what activists like myself and others in our coalition are doing, is trying to get clarity, and also clarity on what weapons are offensive. We just announced a massive weapon sale to the UAE in the lame duck of the Trump administration, and some of those weapons were F-35s or drones. Are those going to be included? We don't know yet. Lastly, we don't know of any military support for the blockade. How this is going to impact that as well. So all key questions we need to keep pressuring them to get.
Yeah, and it seems like there's probably a few related things. There's changes to our policy specifically having to do with Yemen. And then overall, it does seem like they are dialing back the just insane levels of weapons sales and jets and things like that from the past few years that in theory could be used in that conflict. That seems like a pretty big change for the region as a whole, and not just with Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis Yemen, although as you point out, we really do have to see the US has a long history of this sort of support. It's gonna be interesting to see if Biden is actually willing to significantly cut back our military involvement with Saudi Arabia. I don't know what your level of expectations for that are. I know that you're sort of expressing cautious optimism. I guess I'm wondering, and it's impossible to say, what's the distribution of caution and optimism there?
That's the $36 billion question. So, I think we got to keep pressure on Biden, but we can't forget about Congress here. Congress can legislate an end to all of this military support and all of these weapon sales. So we cannot forget about the Congress's role in this whole question, and keeping that pressure on members of Congress to put pressure on the Biden administration is, I think, how we're gonna get to a good place. And I do have cautious optimism. We can work with the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, this year to legislate a permanent end to this war and military support. Now, another thing that we didn't mention is restoring humanitarian aid, and I do want to touch on that a bit, because in March 2020, the Trump administration announced a suspension of all humanitarian assistance to northern Yemen, where the Houthis are. And that's 70% of the country's 30 million population. A massive amount of people were basically cut off from humanitarian assistance from USAID. So that's another thing that we're trying to press on the administration in a very short time frame, because that aid is needed. There are 16 million people living on the brink of famine in Yemen right now. So on top of the military support, which I think we're making some good progress there, we need some clarity still, but we can't forget about the humanitarian aid.
I'd actually like to, because it's been a bit since we spoke, and the time between our last speaking and now has been hardly a situation that's been easy on a lot of the world vis-a-vis the pandemic and all of that. What does the actual situation look like in Yemen? I mean, back before the pandemic, there was famine, there were cholera outbreaks, there was the widespread destruction of infrastructure and medical facilities. How is Yemen actually faring more recently?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I have sobering news. The UN just made an announcement that they fear 2 million children are at risk of malnutrition and death in 2021 if conditions stay the same. There are 16 million people living on the brink of famine. Cholera remains a major issue in the country. And because of the war, 50% of the healthcare facilities have either been completely destroyed or are partially functional because of airstrikes and because of fighting. And when you've got COVID-19, an outbreak of COVID-19 in the country, that's, it's one of the most fatal places in the world for the coronavirus. When you have that situation, it's just absolutely devastating. And unfortunately, the United States is completely complicit because we've been supporting Saudi UAE-led coalition airstrikes and giving intel sharing, logistical support, these spare parts transfers, which keep these Saudi warplanes in the air. So it's a really devastating situation. The other thing I wanted to mention is the blockade is still in effect. And unfortunately, the way the blockade works is sometimes the Saudi coalition allows in food, sometimes they don't. Most recently, they've been choking off the flow of fuel, which has really reduced the capacity of hospitals as they're trying to, take care of people through this terrible pandemic and humanitarian crisis. So that's another piece that we can't forget.
So you were talking earlier about the distinction between offensive support for the war, defensive support, and how we don't know entirely what's in column A, what's in column B, the logistics and the intelligence sharing that you talked about, is that a defensive use? And I'm curious if as you say, we watch and it looks like the promises to cut back support aren't going far enough, aren't as substantive as activists might hope for. Do you think that it might come to a reinvocation of the War Powers Act that they tried to do under Trump, that something like that, an effort or at least the threat of that might be necessary to put further pressure on Joe Biden?
I think it's certainly something that we should keep on the table. I mean, it's going to be a little bit more difficult politically right now to invoke the War Powers Act on the Hill. And just for the sake that Democrats don't want to force the administration's hand. But I've heard members say that they are willing and are open to doing this. And I think that's a really good sign. And beyond just the War Powers Act, like I said before, we still have things like the National Defense Authorization Act, where we can slip a provision in there to completely and permanently end US military support for the war on Yemen, and also cut off weapon sales. So we've got some other vehicles besides the War Powers Act, and I think we have to keep all options on the table. Like I said, I am cautiously optimistic. It seems like the pressure that the activist community in the US has built up over time is really strong, and we have the ear of members of Congress. The conversations I'm having now on the Hill are completely different than the conversations I was having 4 years ago on the Hill. So I just definitely wanted to lift that point up.
Okay, well that's very good news. For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.